Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space. Close your eyes and let the story begin. Story 1: The Sleeping in a Coffin Challenge. The nights in the mountains of West Virginia always carried a strange stillness. Thick black clouds coiled across the sky, casting eerie shadows over the peaks, making the atmosphere feel even heavier. The locals never joked about their folklore, especially the tale of the ancient coffin-sleeping challenge. It was a legend passed down through generations, though no one truly knew if it was real. Some believed that those brave enough to accept the challenge would receive a priceless gift, one that only the truly courageous could attain. However, the price was steep, and those who dared to try never returned. Lance, a 28-year-old man, had just moved to the town of Hickory Grove to work at a small coffee shop. Normally, he wasn't someone who believed in the supernatural, but something about this legend pulled at him from the moment he first heard it: curiosity. The first time he learned of it was in an old bar where elderly men often sat around sharing tales of the region's mysteries. The coffin-sleeping challenge, huh? You don't know, do you? It's real. Folks say if you survive the night, you'll live a peaceful life. No accidents, no sickness, ever again. But if you open your eyes while lying in the coffin, you'll see the person beneath you is still alive and staring straight back at you. One old man, his skin wrinkled and his eyes barely open, spoke with a voice that sent chills down Lance's spine. Those words haunted Lance. He began researching the legend and discovered a troubling pattern. No one had ever truly survived the challenge. Those who attempted it either vanished without a trace or lost their minds, and the coffin itself wasn't just any coffin. It was ancient, adorned with strange carvings no one could decipher. One evening, while Lance was walking through the woods near the old man's home, he heard a strange sound, like someone breathing softly. He stopped, looked around, but saw nothing. The breathing grew louder. Suddenly, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was a man with a strange presence. It was David, someone Lance had only heard of in hushed conversations. "You want to try the challenge, don't you?" David asked with a mysterious smile. "What challenge?" Lance hesitated, uneasy with David's eerie presence. David stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "The coffin-sleeping challenge. I did it, and I saw things no one could ever imagine." Lance swallowed hard, though afraid. His curiosity had grown too strong. He decided he would try, just once, to see the truth behind the legend. The next day, David led Lance deep into the forest, to a place where sunlight seemed unable to reach. They hiked through narrow paths, their footsteps echoing like ghostly whispers. Eventually, they arrived at a clearing where a small house stood, and on the ground lay an old coffin. "This is where it begins. All you have to do is lie down and keep your eyes shut all night. If you succeed, nothing in this life can ever harm you," David explained. Lance stared at the ancient coffin, shivering. The cracks in the wood showed its age, centuries perhaps. The strange symbols carved into its lid seemed to pulse with unease. Still, curiosity overpowered fear. He climbed inside. David helped him in and shut the lid, leaving Lance alone inside with only a small oil lamp for light. The smell of rotting wood and the oppressive silence engulfed him. Lance tried to steady his breathing, but a creeping fear rose in his chest. Time dragged on. At first, he struggled to breathe, and odd sounds began to echo in the darkness. Whispers, then soft footsteps near the coffin. His mind started to blur. Then a chill slithered across his body. A faint, ghostly glow flickered outside the coffin, an unnatural light. Lance tried to open his eyes, but couldn't. He felt as if someone was watching him from beneath the coffin. Soon the fear became overwhelming. He heard heavy breathing, but realized it wasn't his. It came from the foot of the coffin. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to stay calm. But the sound grew louder, closer, as if someone was down there, looking up at him. Suddenly, an ice-cold hand grabbed his foot. Lance screamed in panic, but his voice couldn't escape the sealed coffin. The freezing hand clung to him, pulling downward. Then he heard it, a soft, eerie laugh echoing in the dark. Lance could only hold his breath and fight the urge to open his eyes. Now, he wasn't just facing the challenge of surviving a night in an ancient coffin. He was up against an invisible monster, a terror so deep, he couldn't begin to understand it. And with dawn still far away, and darkness pressing all around him, Lance didn't know if he'd survived the night at all. That night, the truth of the challenge began to unfold. Lance had no idea how long it had been since the coffin was sealed. Every minute felt like an endless year. His breath seemed to blend with the damp air inside the coffin, and his heartbeat pounded like a broken drum against the silence. He couldn't move, couldn't open his eyes, only lie there, letting fear consume his mind. The icy hand he had felt earlier still seemed etched into his skin. The numbness it left behind made it impossible for him to remember whether he was enduring a challenge or facing a true nightmare. Suddenly, a chill swept through the space, as if someone had opened a window inside the coffin. And then, the whispering began. Lance tried to breathe calmly, but the harder he fought to stay composed, the closer he felt to losing his sanity. These sounds weren't the wind, nor insects. They were voices, human voices, the whispers of those who had once lain in this very coffin. He won't make it out alive. A faint voice murmured from the foot of the coffin, as if coming from a faraway place. They'll pull him down, drag him to the darkest place. Another voice rasped, hoarse and trembling, blending with the breath of someone lying beside him. Lance fought to hold himself together, but the freezing hand returned once more from the bottom of the coffin. He held his breath, but couldn't stop trembling. His chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible weight, and he had the eerie sense of thousands of eyes watching him from the darkness. Suddenly, a loud noise startled him from the outside. Wood clashing, he felt someone standing atop the coffin, followed by the sound of footsteps circling around him. Who was it? David? He couldn't think anymore. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, unable to distinguish reality from illusion. Is he ready yet? A raspy voice spoke from directly above his head. Lance tried to turn his body, but he couldn't move. The panic surged stronger. Then he heard a laugh not belonging to the living. It sounded like it came from the corpse of a dead person, as if someone took delight in witnessing his fear. "You can't escape," the voice said again. this time clearer and more threatening. Many have tried. None survived. This coffin isn't just a grave. It's a trap. A trap of nightmares. Lance wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in his throat. He couldn't breathe. Fragmented memories of the ancient coffin, the strange markings on its wooden surface, the ghostly glow in the night, all swirled chaotically in his head. He recalled David's warning not to open his eyes, and a fear beyond words gripped his soul. With his strength nearly gone, Lance tried to open his eyes. Just a little, just to see what was around him. But he couldn't. Something was holding them shut, as if an invisible force was pressing them closed. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if speaking directly into his ear. You cannot win. This death was always meant for you. In a moment of deafening stillness, Lance felt something heavy press against his chest. It wasn't a normal sensation. He couldn't breathe. It felt like someone was sitting on top of him. Helpless and drained, Lance could only lie there, feeling the darkness wrap around him. A sudden loud crack jolted everything around him. The coffin seemed to tear open. Splinters of wood shattered as an eerie light flared from outside. Lance heard the groaning creak of wood breaking. And then, a strange figure appeared. Outside stood a ghostly silhouette. A woman dressed in an old white gown, her long black hair flowing freely, her face pale as a corpse. She stood still, staring directly at Lance with hollow eyes. In that moment, Lance felt nailed in place, unable to move, unable to flee. Her gaze pierced into his mind, rooting him in terror. You've awakened, haven't you? The woman spoke, her voice hollow and cold. Now you'll understand. There are things that should never be touched. And you've awakened them. Something long and shadow-like began coiling around Lance. At this point, he no longer had the strength to panic. Everything had gone beyond the limit of his endurance. He felt the presence of something in the air. Something unseen, yet undeniably there. Something he had stirred awake during this endless night. Suddenly, Lance heard footsteps drawing near, and the dim light of an oil lamp lit up his face. Just enough to reveal a twisted, haunting smile. The night wasn't over yet, and the trial was far from finished. Lance had no idea how much time had passed since he saw that woman. Time seemed to have frozen inside this coffin. Everything was a blur, as if he was sinking into a space beyond time, where every second stretched into eternity. But what terrified him wasn't the ghost or the strange noises. It was the feeling of being utterly trapped. No matter how much he wanted to open his eyes or scream in panic, his body no longer felt like his own. As shadows began to coil around his body, Lance felt them like icy waves, brushing against his skin, seeping through his flesh. A cold hand touched his neck, as if someone was checking whether he was still breathing. Every time he tried to move, his body grew heavier, like something was holding him down, refusing to let him escape. The whispering returned, this time clearer than ever. The sounds echoed from deep within the coffin, like thousands of souls were trying to speak to him. You can't escape, said the voice of the woman he had seen in the dark. This death has been waiting for you. Lance swallowed hard, a pain like a blade slicing through his heart. Each whisper tore through his mind. The surrounding coldness crushed his lungs, making it hard to breathe. His eyes began to shut, though he fought to keep them open. But the darkness in the coffin was like a bottomless pit, dragging him down. Suddenly, A sound came from outside the coffin. What was that? Something had fallen, something heavy, striking the ground. Then came footsteps, soft but unmistakable in the dead silence. Lance clung to a shred of hope, but stillness only deepened his dread. The coffin lid began to open slowly, as if pushed by some unseen force. Lance couldn't believe his eyes. He couldn't understand why or how the coffin was opening. From the outside, a dim light streamed in, stabbing at his eyes, but he was still unable to move. A figure appeared outside. Lance wanted to scream, but his throat was dry. It was a man, but something was wrong. He wore all black, his face hidden in shadows, only a pair of cold, glowing eyes visible. Void of emotion, the man stood silently, staring into the coffin. Lance could feel a strange power radiating from him, as if this man was a part of the trial, a piece of the nightmare from which he could not wake. "You can't leave," the man's voice echoed, emotionless and chilling. "This is the fate of those who dare challenge it." Then Lance realized the truth. Everyone who had taken part in this challenge was trapped in a spiral of fear and death. None of them ever escaped. No one had ever survived. The cold hands returned, gripping him harder this time, pulling him deeper into the coffin. Lance felt like he was being dragged into an invisible abyss, and in that moment, he sensed the life slipping away from his body. He wanted to scream, but couldn't. Only the sound of his heavy, labored breathing remained, along with the strange whispers echoing in his mind. His body felt like it was falling apart. He couldn't endure it any longer. Blurry memories and faint images from his past began flooding back. Nights he had lived, things he had done, they all fused into this darkness. And then something changed. Suddenly, a cracking noise rang out, wood breaking. The coffin began to shake violently, as if some force was striking it from outside. Lance felt himself being pushed up, then pulled back down. But this time, he couldn't bear it anymore. He cried, helpless and overwhelmed by fear. "You can't go outside." The man's voice rang out again. "You are just a part of this story." Forever, the surrounding noises turned into chaos. Lance couldn't comprehend what was happening. The coffin began to splinter, light blurring around him. And then, like a cold gust of wind, everything went silent. When he opened his eyes again, the sight before him was unbelievable. He was standing on a bridge, a decaying ancient bridge spanning over a pitch-black river. No one was around. Only strange echoes rose from the depths below. Lance turned around, but saw nothing. A biting chill spread across his skin. There was something off in the air, as if something was waiting for him ahead. He didn't know where he was, or if he was even still alive. A soft laugh echoed behind him. Lance turned back, but this time, there was no one. Only darkness. Darkness that stretched endlessly. He didn't understand it, but this wasn't release. It was only the beginning of another trial. A death he could never escape. Story 2. The sense of death approaching. When Hannah realized that something was wrong, she couldn't shake the feeling that death was lingering at the end of her path. It wasn't just a simple fear. It was something deeper, heavier, a strange intuition that her final day was drawing near. Everything began on an autumn night. The long days of summer had ended, and the crisp fall air filled the space, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and a chilling mist. Hannah, a woman in her 30s, lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of an Ohio city. She had lived there for many years, but recently something felt off. As the nights grew longer, she could no longer escape the sensation that someone was watching her. No matter where she was inside the house, that feeling started when she began seeing her own silhouette each morning upon waking. At first, she thought it was just a nightmare or a blurry remnant of an unclear dream, but gradually, the figure became clearer, more defined, and closer. She couldn't explain it, and it sent shivers down her spine, keeping her from sleeping peacefully, even deep into the night. One evening, while sitting in her armchair in the living room, reading, the faint glow of a bedside lamp illuminated the space. She felt the presence again. It wasn't a sound, nor a shift in the atmosphere. It was something more abstract, something unseen but undeniably there, like a shadow drifting around her, sipping the air. She turned her head, but there was only empty space. She reassured herself it was just her imagination. But then, she saw her silhouette, standing silently at the end of the hallway, watching her. A stranger, perhaps an intruder. But how? The house was too small, and she was completely alone. The sight sent chills through her body, her heart pounding loudly, each beat echoing like a warning bell inside her head. She couldn't stop thinking about the silhouette. It wasn't just a human figure. It was a reflection of herself, but missing something vital. Life. That figure didn't move. It simply stood there, silent and faded like a ghost. Hannah tried calling her own name, but there was no response. As she took a step closer, the figure vanished like an illusion. She stood there, heart racing, filled with confusion. She couldn't make sense of what had just happened. A part of her wanted to brush it off and return to normal life. But deep down, she knew that presence couldn't have been coincidence. In the nights that followed, the feeling only grew stronger. She didn't just see her reflection from a distance anymore. She could feel something approaching her, step by step. And what was even more terrifying was that each night, the figure moved closer. Hannah searched her home for any signs. Open windows, evidence of a break-in, but found nothing. There was no trace of anyone else being there. Yet the presence returned night after night, growing more intense. She couldn't avoid it anymore, and the closer she felt to death, the more real and alive that figure seemed to become. One night, as cold wind blew through the window and moonlight streamed through the curtains, Hannah woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. She felt the presence again. But this time, it wasn't just her own silhouette. It had changed. It had become something else. Something larger, darker, as if it had been born from her own fear. With her heart racing, she stepped out of bed and into the hallway. The faint glow of the nightlight was just enough to reveal a figure standing quietly at the end. But when she looked more closely, it wasn't her reflection anymore. It was ghostly shape with a blurred form and eyes glowing red like fire. She felt its gaze pierce her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of despair. Hannah couldn't move. Though she tried to scream, only shallow breaths escaped her lips. Her vacant eyes stared helplessly at the ghostly figure. Suddenly, it lifted its foot and began to walk toward her. She couldn't run, couldn't scream. Its presence pressed down on her like an invisible weight, suffocating her. and as it came closer, she heard a cold, hollow laugh echo inside her mind, as if it had been waiting for her. The figure stood directly in front of her, and for a brief moment, she realized it wasn't just a ghost. It was something that had existed in the darkness for a very long time, just waiting for the chance to draw near and claim her soul. And then the darkness swallowed everything. Since that night, Hannah could no longer sleep peacefully. She stayed awake, her tired eyes fixed on the walls of her room, as if hoping they would protect her from the deadly shadow creeping closer. But the truth was, that feeling, the strange, deathly presence, never left her. It clung to her like an inseparable shadow, haunting her every step, every breath. Each night, as darkness fell, she could feel its presence. The shadow no longer lingered at the end of the hallway. This time, it had entered her room. That dark figure had become something else. Something that couldn't be described with words. Not the shape of a person, but a shadow infused with death, dread, and inescapable horror. Hannah no longer dared to go outside at night. She locked the doors, pulled the curtains tight, and lay motionless in her room. But the darkness would not spare her. It watched her from every corner, seeping through every crack, making the air around her grow heavier with each passing hour. She could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. Each night, the shadow crept closer, its footsteps becoming clearer, as if it was ready to step into her life. On an especially cold night, as the wind howled outside the window, Hannah heard strange noises. At first, she thought it was just the wind whistling through the cracks, but the sounds became more distinct, like someone pacing inside her room, heavy steps brushing against the floorboards. She trembled, staring at the door, certain someone was standing just outside, waiting. Her heart pounded, but she didn't dare move or call out to anyone. The feeling of being watched had become an inevitable part of her life. She listened carefully, trying to detect every sound, every unusual breath. And then, as the footsteps reached her door, it slowly creaked open, on its own, as if someone had turned the handle and opened it without warning. She stared into the pitch-black darkness beyond the door, but saw nothing. Yet the weight in the air was unmistakable. It was the feeling of death, of utter silence, a sensation as though the entire world had vanished, leaving only her and the shadow drawing near. She wanted to scream, but her throat tightened. No sound came out. Suddenly, she saw a pair of glowing red eyes flash in the darkness, then vanish just as quickly. She couldn't breathe. Her heart felt like it would explode. From that night on, those eyes kept appearing. Eyes that didn't belong to anyone. Not human eyes, but ones that stared directly at her from the shadows. The shadow drew closer with every passing night, and its form became more distinct. One night, when she woke up from a nightmare, she saw it, standing right beside her bed. It no longer resembled her. It was a terrifying figure, a creature of indeterminate shape, with only burning red eyes glaring down at her. She panicked and screamed, but an icy hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her cry. That hand was cold as death, and from somewhere near her ear, a whisper echoed softly. "It's time." Hannah couldn't understand what was happening. She struggled, but the darkness seemed to pin her down, refusing to let her go. Her mind spun, and the image of the shadow grew clearer with each second. It was no longer an invisible ghost. It had a form now, a creature from the darkness, able to move through any space without being seen. She couldn't remember when she finally fell back asleep, but when she woke the next morning, everything seemed normal. Yet deep down, she knew something had changed. The shadow no longer haunted her only at night. It had started to appear during the day. When she went out, shopping, walking in the park, she always felt eyes watching her. One day, passing a large mirror at the mall, she saw it, her own reflection, standing beside her in the mirror. But when she turned around, no one was there. She returned home in a state of panic, unable to take it anymore. The feeling that death was drawing closer every minute suffocated her. She had no choice but to confront it. She reached out to an old friend, Emma, someone she once trusted. Emma listened to Hannah's story, remaining silent for a moment. She looked into Hannah's eyes, as if searching for some sign that this was all in her imagination. But when she saw the raw fear and desperation in Hannah's gaze, she knew something real was happening. "Don't let the shadow consume your mind," Emma said firmly. "But if you truly feel something is wrong, I'll help you dig deeper into these strange occurrences." Hannah nodded, tears streaming down her face, as she realized she couldn't face this alone. But deep inside, she knew that if she didn't find a way to stop it, the shadow would never let her go. And in the nights that followed, the shadow kept following her. Its presence grew stronger with each passing night, and she knew death was no longer far away. Ever since the night she faced the shadow in her room, Hannah was no longer the confident, strong girl she once was. With each passing day, she felt a noticeable shift within herself. A paralyzing numbness, both mental and physical, had begun to take hold of her. Daylight no longer brought her peace. Every step she took felt heavy, as if burdened by an invisible weight. Even after seeking help from Emma, her old friend, nothing seemed to work. Emma's advice, whether comforting words or suggestions to explore the supernatural, couldn't shake the fear that clung to her. The shadow wasn't confined to the darkness anymore. It had begun to spill into every corner of her life, blurring the boundary between the world of the dead and that of the living. She no longer felt safe in her own home. One night, as she sat alone in the living room beneath the dim flicker of her desk lamp, the window suddenly burst open. A cold gust of wind rushed in, making the curtains dance like invisible arms reaching into the world. She stood to close it, but when she turned around, she saw it. This time, it wasn't just a vague shape. It was a clear figure. A shadowy presence stood right in the middle of the room. It wasn't her reflection. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was a grotesque form, something that didn't belong in this world. Its eyes blazed a furious red, like twin flames, locking onto her and pulling her in, as though she were being consumed. The shadow moved slowly, but with each step the air grew heavier, like it was pressing directly onto her soul. She backed away, heart pounding so hard it left her breathless. Then suddenly, it began walking toward her. Each step sounded like death knocking at her door. Her mind went blank. She didn't know what to do. Just then, a gentle knock at the front door startled her, and she whipped around. She couldn't explain what she was feeling. Everything blurred. The room lost its focus. and all she could see was that shadow standing right before her. She bolted toward the front door, but when she opened it, no one was there. Just the freezing air and a silence that screamed. When she turned back, the shadow was gone. Hannah didn't know if she was still awake or trapped in some nightmarish dream. She stood frozen, terrified, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Everything around her seemed faded, leaving behind only the cold and the lurking presence of that shadow, hiding somewhere in the room. In a panic, she sought out Emma once again. This time, she didn't just talk about the strange occurrences. She opened up about a dream she had the night before. In the dream, she stood on an old bridge, watching her own silhouette from afar. But she couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't run. She just stood there, helpless, as the shadow crept closer. When Hannah finished, Emma's face turned pale. She didn't respond immediately. It took a long moment before she spoke. "What you're dealing with, it's not random," Emma said, her voice low. "That shadow, it's a sign, a warning. I think you need to see someone who can help you understand what's really happening." Hannah stared at Emma, unsure what to say. She didn't have much hope left, but with no other options, she decided to follow Emma's advice and meet the person she referred to as a specialist in strange phenomena. She met this person one afternoon, under the weak sunlight spilling across the streets. The woman was middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a stern face. Her name was Rachel, and she was known to have studied the supernatural for years. When Hannah recounted her story, Rachel listened silently, never interrupting. After she finished, Rachel didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked at Hannah as if she had known this all along. "The shadow you saw isn't just any shadow," Rachel said. "It's something we call the mark of death." "Death?" Hannah whispered, hardly able to believe her ears. "What does that mean?" "We all have a destined time. A moment that fate has already written," Rachel explained. "When that time approaches, the soul begins to be pulled toward another realm. That shadow is the symbol of death drawing near. It doesn't just appear in the dark. It'll follow you anywhere until you can no longer escape the truth." Rachel's words hit Hannah like a slap to the face. This wasn't just hallucination. It wasn't just a nightmare. Death was truly coming for her, and nothing could stop it. The world felt like it was closing in. The walls of her home seemed ready to collapse, and the shadow was still chasing her. "But how do I stop it?" Hannah asked desperately. Rachel looked at her, worry in her eyes, then answered slowly, "The only way to stop it is to face death itself. Don't run from it. Don't let fear control you. When you confront it, when you accept that your fate cannot be changed, that's when the shadow will disappear." But Hannah wasn't sure if she had the courage. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from being swallowed by eternal darkness. When she returned home, everything looked the same, but something inside her had shifted. The shadow was still there, still watching, but there was something new within her too. A flicker of courage she had never felt before. She didn't know if she could win, but she now understood that unless she faced it, she'd be trapped in this spiral forever. Each night, the figure drew closer. But this time, Hannah no longer trembled. She would not let it win. Story 3. Whisper her name and she will find you. The Curse of Taliamaro. There was a group known for telling ghost stories online, famous among horror enthusiasts. Every night, as the clock struck midnight, they would enter a virtual realm, an eerie world behind the screen, where they shared stories that sent shivers down listeners' spines. But that night, everything changed. The lead narrator was Mark, a young man who played a crucial role in the group. His voice was deep and warm, though at times it could turn cold, like wind drifting through ancient ruins. That night, as usual, the group began streaming at 11:30 p.m. The atmosphere in the live stream room felt unusually tense. Everyone was prepared, armed with carefully selected stories. The main feature for the evening was a chilling tale called Hatred Within the Old House. However, before Mark began, he glanced through a list of ancient spirits the group had collected from old graveyards. On that list was a name he had never seen before, Talia Maro. He read it again, a sense of unease creeping into him. Why was that name there? Everyone in the group felt the same discomfort, but brushed it off as typical nerves that came with telling ghost stories. At exactly 12 a.m., as the on-screen clock struck midnight, Mark began the introduction. He moved into the ritual section of the show, where all the members would close their eyes and chant to invite the spirit associated with the story. But Mark, in a brief moment of carelessness, misread the incantation. Instead of naming the spirit listed in their notes, he accidentally blurted out the unfamiliar name, Talia Maro. Immediately, every member's phone emitted a strange, distorted sound. Their computer screens flickered, filled with static. First, there was a soft, weak sigh, then a faint laugh whispered from behind their monitors. The group sensed something was wrong. A chilling cold swept over them, though they assumed it was just the nerves from streaming live. However, once the live stream ended, strange things began to happen. Each member started receiving bizarre notifications from the system. Every recording from that night's stream was corrupted. And most disturbing of all, at the end of each video, a face appeared. A face no one in the group recognized. It didn't look human. The eyes bulged, the skin pale and rough, covered in gruesome scars as if it had been burned. The face dominated the screen, grotesque and terrifying. And worst of all, no one had seen it during the live stream. In the days that followed, the phenomena grew worse. Mark received a phone call in the middle of the night. A voice whispered into his ear, "Talia is waiting." The other end was silent, yet the voice clearly came from his own speaker, from the phone he held in his hand. Mark was terrified, but he didn't tell anyone. He hoped it was just a prank, but deep down, the fear refused to leave. Since that night, every live stream was disrupted. Flickering screens, distorted audio, damaged files. And sometimes, even while they were speaking, a cold whisper echoed through the room. Talia. Talia Maro. The other members of the group began to panic. Some quit. Others were haunted by strange dreams. In those dreams, they stood before a mist-covered grave, bearing only one name, carved into the headstone, Talia Maro. Then one day, as they tried to review a recording for editing, they uncovered something terrifying. The video was not only corrupted, it showed a horrifying image. A blackened, rotting hand reaching out from the screen as if trying to grab them. This wasn't a glitch. It was as if an invisible force had reached into their systems and ruined everything. Desperate to understand what was happening, The group began researching the mysterious name. And what they found was horrifying. Talia Maro was no ordinary ghost. She was an ancient entity tied to old legends. A woman once exiled and murdered out of jealousy by her own village. She had been summoned using forbidden rituals. Rituals that the group had unknowingly reenacted. And now, she wasn't just haunting them through screens. She was trying to take over their bodies. The group realized they had awakened something beyond their control. The more they tried to escape, the deeper they were pulled into a spiral of horror and obsession. With each live stream, Talia Maro's face appeared clearer, closer, until it was no longer just a nightmare inside their machines. She had crossed into the real world. Ever since the strange incident, Mark hadn't known peace. In the days that followed, he felt as if a shadow clung to him, something inexplicable that made it impossible to sleep. Every time the faint lights flickered on in his room, Mark thought something would appear. That grotesque face, or those shifting shadows lingering in the corners, despite warnings from the remaining members of the group. Mark decided to host another live stream the next night. Fear wasn't enough to stop him, because somewhere inside, he still held on to a faint hope that if he just performed the ritual one more time, everything might return to normal. The events of that night haunted Mark for an entire week. He couldn't forget the whispers that echoed from the old speakers in his room, the eerie laughter that kept his eyes glued to the screen. The video files remained corrupted, and this time, that face didn't just appear at the end. It was there from the very beginning, staring straight into his eyes as if reaching out from the other side of the screen. Then came the voice again, strange and chilling, breaking through the silence of the room. Talia Maro. It echoed like a haunting invitation, chilling Mark to the core. Every time he reached for the screen to shut it off, his hand stuck to something wet, something icy cold. He shuddered, half convinced that the name, Talia Maro, wasn't just a name anymore, but a real presence inside his room. And that grotesque face. It was getting closer, waiting for the moment to step out from the screen and into the real world. Immediately, Mark called the rest of the team, those who had quietly stepped away after the incident. That night they agreed to meet, not to stream, but to find answers about the curse and that unsettling name. They gathered at a small cafe on the edge of town, the atmosphere between them tense and heavy. They were no longer just friends. They were people haunted by a force they couldn't understand or control. Sitting under the dim lights, an unshakable unease settled over them. Amy, one of the group members, was the first to speak. Mark, we have to stop. Something really bad has started. Both Tommy and I have been having strange dreams. Dreams with Talia Maro in them. I can't sleep anymore. I feel like someone standing outside my window, even when I don't dare to look. Tommy, usually quiet, spoke in a low, trembling voice. I tried looking up information on Talia. It's not a normal name. She's not just a spirit. She's something else, a revenant. I think we might have accidentally unleashed an ancient curse. A cold chill ran down Mark's spine. He had sensed the danger, but deep down, he had still hoped everything could be undone. Is there a way to fix it? He asked. Amy was silent for a moment before replying. I've heard of a ritual, one that can banish released spirits, but it's not easy. If done wrong, the consequences could be far worse. Just as she finished speaking, a loud noise came from behind them. They all turned, but saw nothing, only darkness. Yet the thick pressure in the air made it hard to breathe. Back at home, Mark began searching for the ritual Amy had mentioned. An ancient rite said to banish vengeful spirits. He found an old book, its cover faded and its pages torn and fragile. Inside were detailed instructions on how to summon and then dismiss long imprisoned souls. Talia Maro, according to the book, was the spirit of a woman ostracized and murdered hundreds of years ago. But her name wasn't just folklore. It was tied to real events in an abandoned village where people whispered that anyone who called her name would pay a terrible price. Mark decided to follow the book's instructions. What he didn't know was that the more he followed, the deeper he was pulling himself into an endless loop with no escape. That night, as darkness enveloped the house, Mark turned on his computer and began the ritual. He closed his eyes, reading each word from the book aloud, but an unsettling feeling wrapped around him. Shadows began to creep into the room, and for the first time since everything began, Mark felt the undeniable presence of Talia Maro. The wind outside howled louder. The window swung open on its own, and then the voice came again, clearer than ever. Talia, Maro. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream tearing through space and time. Mark opened his eyes, and on the computer screen was the image of a woman. She had no eyes, but the light from the screen lit up the grotesque wounds on her face, making every detail painfully real, as if she was standing right in front of him. "She's here," Mark whispered, and the last thing he heard before the screen went black was a high-pitched, shrill laughter echoing through the darkness. Mark woke up in the pitch-dark night, unable to remember how long he had been asleep. The chill still lingered on his skin, but it wasn't an ordinary kind of cold. It was the kind that comes with fear, the kind that numbs every sense and blurs the line between reality and illusion. He sat up, his head spinning, and the light from the computer screen before him still glowed dimly. But the screen, it was no longer that of an ordinary computer. It had become a window into another realm, a realm of darkness and dread. A familiar laugh, soft but chilling, echoed from the shadows. Talia Maro was no longer just a name from a horror tale. She was now a presence that had stepped out from the screen. And she was here, in Mark's world. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He stood up and looked around, seeing only darkness. A thin mist cloaked the room, and the air had grown so thick that every step felt like wading through molasses. He closed his eyes, trying to calm himself, but the moment he opened them again, he saw the figure standing in the center of the room. It was her, Talia Maro, her form vague and indistinct, yet terrifying enough to stop his heart. Her name echoed inside Mark's head as if it had been carved into the very cells of his body. He didn't dare move, only stood and stared, shivers crawling relentlessly up his spine. "You invited me," the voice said, soft as a cold wind, yet commanding. "And now, you will pay the price." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. His vision blurred, and Talia's image began to shift, morphing in ways that defied logic. The scars on her face stretched and spiraled into his eyes, pulling him into a bottomless pit of darkness. Suddenly, everything around him began to disintegrate. The computer screen, the objects in his room, All of it began melting under an unseen force. And then, before Mark could even grasp what was happening, he found himself elsewhere, a desolate village, surrounded by abandoned, dust-covered houses. There was no sound, no sign of life, only an eerie silence, broken only by the wind whispering through every crevice, carrying with it the scent of damp decay. "Welcome home, Mark," Talia's voice rang from behind him, no longer coming from a screen, but as if she were right beside him. Mark turned around, and there she was, still a hazy silhouette, undefined, but radiating an uncanny force, pressing down on the air around her. She pointed to the decrepit houses surrounding them and let out a cold, sharp laugh. "This is my village, the place where I died. What you see now is what remained after I was murdered." Her eyes gleamed with a crimson glow. "And now, you'll witness your own end." Mark didn't understand. How did he get here? How had he fallen into a digital world with no exit? He turned to run, but each step felt like something was anchoring him to the ground, forcing him to look back, until he couldn't take it anymore. He collapsed onto the ground, and the horrors began to pour in. From the surrounding houses, shadowy images emerged, figures with glowing eyes, whispers that couldn't be understood. But these weren't ordinary spirits. They pulsed with life, with a strange power, as if they had never truly died, merely waited to be unleashed. Talia stood still, watching him with a wicked smile. "Did you really think you could escape? This is the fate of those who dared awaken me." A massive door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black chamber beyond. Mark could feel it. It was the door to the end. He couldn't go back. He couldn't flee. His feet felt glued to the ground, and even though he tried to scream, no sound escaped his throat. Then something strange flashed in his mind. He was back in his room, back in front of the computer, the screen still lit up. Story 3 whisper. Her name and she will find you. The Curse of Talia Maro. But it wasn't just an ordinary image. There she was again, Talia Maro. Only this time, she wasn't a ghost. She was a monster. Her eyes blazed red and her mouth opened impossibly wide, as if ready to swallow the entire world. Terror gripped Mark. His breath began to fade. A suffocating pressure spread through his body. And he understood. This wasn't a dream. This was real. Talia Maro was not just a name. She was a creature of the dark, pulling everyone into her world. As he struggled to breathe, a strange shift occurred. The ghosts vanished. The room returned Trevor to what it once was, as if his subconscious mind had forced it back to normal. But Mark knew it wasn't the room that had changed. It was him. He had been pulled into a spiral he could never escape. Talia was still there, still behind him. She sighed softly, as if waiting for something. And then Mark heard her final words, like an eternal curse. "Every time you come back, you'll see me. And this time, you'll never leave me again." And with that, everything, every image, every space, was swallowed by endless black. Story 4. Awake in a world that isn't mine. When I woke up, it wasn't because of an alarm, nor the glaring sunlight of morning. In fact, it was a strange kind of darkness. A darkness I couldn't explain, like a black veil that completely shrouded everything around me. The first thing I felt was pain. A searing pain that shot deep into my bones, leaving me breathless for a moment. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. A fragment of pain, loss, and panic wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. It was a bizarre sensation, as though my body were collapsing in some dark cosmic void. And then I suddenly remembered the accident. A fatal moment, the car crashing straight into the fence, my body thrown out, my head hitting the ground, everything fading, the only thing left being the sound of shattering and silence. When I woke up again, my body no longer felt like my own. My eyes, these two eyes, had completely changed. My right eye bore a scar down the corner, making me feel as if it no longer belonged to me. My left eye, a deep, endless black that didn't reflect light, like a bottomless pit. But the strangeness didn't stop there. When I opened my eyes for the first time after the accident, I didn't see what I expected. I didn't see a familiar hospital room with white walls and sterile medical equipment. No, I saw something completely different. Everything around me had turned into something strange. Mutated versions of what I once knew. The hospital room was no longer the one I remembered. Now it was an enormous space, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The furniture and objects inside were distorted like a nightmare. Hospital beds and medical tools stretched endlessly, deformed and grotesque. The people moving in the room, doctors, nurses, they weren't the people I once knew. They looked like phantoms, blurred, shadowy figures, their eyes pitch black and soulless. They weren't human, but strange beings, as if they lived in another world, a parallel world I couldn't understand. I tried to call for a doctor, but no words came from my mouth. I wanted to touch them, to make contact, but when I looked down at my own hand, it wasn't my hand anymore. My skin had turned pale, and my fingers had become long, grotesque extensions, like something from a place I couldn't name. I felt like I was slowly leaving my body, like I was no longer human. Trying to remain calm, I decided to leave the hospital room. My legs, although in pain, still moved, though I couldn't understand how I was even able to walk. But as I stepped into the hallway, I realized the world outside was no longer the world I had known. The hospital doors opened, and I walked into pure darkness. Endless hallways with no light, no signs of life, only a sense of unfamiliarity, as if everything was slowly dissolving into something incomprehensible. I tried to find a way out, but the corridors just stretched on, longer and longer, as if they had no end. Suddenly, a soft laugh echoed from behind me. I turned around, but saw nothing, just the darkness, an empty void. Then, a figure appeared. A man stood at the end of the hallway, watching me. His eyes, like mine, dark, lifeless. He stepped closer, and in the dim flicker of the hallway light, I saw his face begin to melt, like a shattered mask slipping off. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs felt paralyzed, refusing to move. And then I heard a voice, soft but cold. "Don't run. We're together now." When I turned back, he was gone. But the strange sensation lingered, as if I couldn't escape this place. The space around me continued to shift, and I realized that nothing was the same anymore. The people around me weren't people. They were something else. Phantoms, creatures of this strange world. And I was now one of them. So began my journey with no escape. In this world, everything can change. People are not what they appear to be. And I had become part of this surreal place. A place where nothing is real anymore. My eyes, though they no longer saw reality, now revealed things others couldn't. Bizarre creatures, ghastly visions, and things I could never have imagined. A world entirely different, where the boundary between life and death had completely blurred. After the strange incident at the hospital, I had no idea how far I had walked. But I kept going. Each step felt aimless. Every hallway I passed looked the same, stretching on endlessly, and the darkness thickened with every turn. As if it were trying to swallow me whole, I could no longer speak. My eyes, the ones that had changed after the accident, no longer helped me see reality. They opened up visions I couldn't explain. Blurred images, eerie figures drifting around me. They say the eyes are the windows to the soul, but for me, they had become portals to a terrifying and shadow-filled world. In those moments, a question lingered in my mind, one I couldn't shake. Am I dreaming or awake? Am I trapped in a nightmare I can't escape? But as the strange sensations intensified, I realized this wasn't a dream. This was reality. A twisted, unfamiliar reality where nothing could be explained. Eventually, I stopped in front of an old, decaying room. The wooden door was thin and clouded, like it had been forgotten for years. Inside, a faint, ghostly light glowed. I stepped in, not knowing why, as if some invisible force was pulling me forward. As I crossed the threshold, I immediately sensed that the space inside was wrong. It didn't resemble any room I'd ever seen. Furniture floated weightlessly, chairs and tables suspended in the air, defying every known law of physics. And then I saw her, a figure sitting on a chair near the door. A chill ran down my spine. It was a woman, but not a normal one. She had no face, only pale, smooth skin, without eyes, without a mouth. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't turn back. My feet were glued to the floor. A voice whispered in my mind, gentle yet haunting. You cannot escape. You've stepped into this world, and now you are part of it. My heart pounded, like it was trying to burst through my chest. I swallowed hard, but my throat was sealed shut. The faceless figure began to rise. Her long, pale fingers slowly stretched toward me. Each of her movements felt like an omen, a signal that everything was about to collapse. No! I screamed internally, but my voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The woman drew closer, and when she touched my hand, a wave of unbearable cold spread through my body. Her fingers sank into my flesh, and instead of pain, I felt a numbness, a slow draining of life from my very core. There is no escape from this world, she whispered. And in that instant, I felt myself being pulled into an endless loop. No beginning, no end. Everything around me blurred, and I no longer knew where I was. The room, the hallway, the hospital, they all melted into a chaotic maze without origin or conclusion. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in that strange room. Instead, I found myself standing on a deserted road, unsure how I got there. But it wasn't any ordinary road. It stretched on endlessly, so silent that I could hear each of my own footsteps echoing. The street lights didn't shine normally. They flickered with a weak, dying glow, as if struggling to stay lit. I didn't know how long I had been walking. The farther I went, the more grotesque visions surrounded me. Faceless figures, unrecognizable creatures, all circling me. My eyes, no longer human eyes, only showed me monstrous beings, images so horrific I could no longer distinguish illusion from truth. And then I heard laughter, not human laughter, cold, soulless, as if it came from some deep, forsaken place. I turned, but saw nothing. Shadows flickered before me, formless phantoms watching me from the darkness. I tried to run, but my legs felt shackled. Every step grew heavier, as if something unseen was holding me back. My eyes, now stripped of reality, continued to reveal horrors beyond comprehension. I knew I couldn't escape. I was trapped in a world I didn't understand, and I didn't know if I could hold on to what was left of my sanity. The darkness grew thicker, and all I had left was fear. Pure, unrelenting fear. As every step led me closer to total annihilation, as I walked further down the empty road, the frigid air wrapped around me like a thin cloak, making me feel as if I was slowly sinking into darkness. The street lights, once ordinary poles of light, had become grotesque figures. Their glow was no longer the usual brightness, but a murky, dim haze, as if veiled by a thick fog that made everything blurred and indistinct. My footsteps echoed into the complete silence, yet the sound seemed swallowed by the empty space around me. With every step, a weight pressed heavier on my chest, as if I were being pulled into a bottomless pit. I tried to breathe steadily, but the harder I tried, the more breathless I became. Like the air itself was being siphoned from my lungs. I looked around, but nothing changed. The road stretched endlessly, silent and abandoned. Shapeless shadows drifted past, as if they were watching me. Strange beings that didn't belong in this world. And then I realized I wasn't alone. Not in the real world, but in the world my eyes now led me into. I could feel a presence. Something that might be a ghost, a forgotten soul, or perhaps something far more malevolent, lurking in the shadows, tracking my every move. I stopped. I couldn't go any further. A fear I couldn't describe rooted me to the spot, though I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Still, my legs refused to move, as if they were buried in cold earth. And then, as if emerging from the dark itself, a laugh rang out, cold and dry. It wasn't like any laugh I'd ever heard. It made me feel like I was trapped in a nightmare I'd never wake from. That laugh wasn't human. It belonged to something else. A creature, a spirit, or some other vile entity living in the dark, where reality no longer existed. I turned around, but saw only shadows, blurry shapes slipping past in the darkness. No one stood behind me, yet I could feel a presence. So strong, it was impossible to ignore. I couldn't describe it, but it was like an invisible hand clutching my heart, making it impossible to breathe. Then, a figure appeared before me. A man standing silently in the middle of the road. He wore dark clothing, his face obscured beneath the cap, but I could feel his eyes, even though I couldn't see them. They were like voids, bottomless, pulling me in. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring at me. And then I heard a voice. Not from him, but inside my mind. "You cannot escape. You will never escape." It felt like I was being sucked into a vortex. A spiraling chaos of images, sounds, and sensations I couldn't make sense of. I turned away, unsure of what I was doing, only knowing that I had to move. I had to flee this place. I began to run, but my legs were sluggish, as if weighed down by something unseen. Everything around me spun. The road grew longer, more distant. The street lights dimmed further, their glow flickering out until only darkness remained. The shadows returned. This time not one, but many. They had no distinct form, but I knew they were moving toward me. Terror rose inside me, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep running. I had to escape. As I ran, I could hear my own gasping breath echoing in the void, like I was trying to breathe in a space with no air. Chaos swirled around me. The shadows passed again and again, endlessly, without pause. And then I saw a door, a black iron door. It had been there all along, perhaps. I didn't stop to think. I just knew I had to get out. I hurled myself toward the door, but the moment I touched it, a paralyzing sensation overtook me. The door didn't open. It screeched, a high-pitched metallic scream, like it was resisting my very presence. In that moment, a searing pain crashed through me. My eyes felt as if they shattered. A sharp agony throbbed in my skull. I dropped my knees, breathless. The shadows around me began pulling me inward, dragging me deeper into a darkness I could not escape. And then, the space changed. The door opened, but behind it wasn't the world I knew. It was another world, a world beyond comprehension. I stepped through the door, and as I looked back, I saw that the empty road had vanished. All that remained was infinite darkness, and me, no longer the person I once was. The laughter still echoed in my mind, as if it would never end. Story 5. When the dead come back to finish the curse. It all began on a stormy night, as my group of friends sat gathered in the living room of an old house on the outskirts of the city. The house had been bought by my family from a distant relative, but from the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The gloomy atmosphere, the faded walls, and the cold wind whistling through the window cracks filled me with unease. There were 4 of us: me, Mike, Sarah, and Jane. We had been close friends since high school, having shared countless moments, both joyful and painful, through the years. But none of us could have imagined that night would mark the beginning of a haunting we could never escape. Mike's death, it was a car accident on a crisp autumn morning. Mike, the funniest one in our group, the one who always made us laugh and brightened the room, was suddenly gone. When we got the news that he didn't make it, I felt like my heart stopped. None of us could believe it. He had just left home for work, and now he was gone forever. Mike's funeral was steeped in heavy, somber silence. People said their goodbyes, but in everyone's eyes was a stunned disbelief. We couldn't stop thinking about him, about his smile, his jokes, our gatherings, but something strange happened. That very night after the funeral, I started having disturbing dreams about Mike. The dreams. The first dream came during a stormy night while I was asleep in my small bedroom. I saw Mike standing there in the old clothes he used to wear, his face expressionless. He just stared at me, saying nothing. But his eyes held an unbearable sadness. I wanted to call his name, but my throat tightened, and no sound came out. "Help me, please," Mike whispered in the wind. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The chill from that dream clung to me well into the morning. And then I found out I wasn't alone. Sarah was the first to confess that she had also dreamt of Mike. But Sarah's story chilled me to the bone. In her dream, Mike didn't just appear. He was furious. He banged on the window screaming, "It's your turn. You'll all pay." Sarah awoke with her eyes wide open. shaking uncontrollably. She tried to hide her fear, but I knew it wasn't just a dream. Something was happening. The curse begins. Day by day, the strange dreams continued. Even Jane, the calmest of us all, began to experience them, but her dream was different. She saw herself standing before an abandoned bridge, and Mike was there, waiting. "I need you. You have to help me," he said, his voice low and filled with pain. The dreams grew more vivid and disturbing. Each time I woke up, I felt as if I was still trapped in a nightmare with no exit. And then one night, something truly terrifying happened. The price to pay. A week after the dreams began, we received an anonymous letter. No return address, only a single hurried sentence. "You must fulfill the curse before it's too late." Each of us had once made a promise to Mike. Simple promises we thought were nothing more than playful vows. But now, after these haunting dreams and this mysterious message, I began to understand. The curse wasn't a joke. For the first time in my life, I felt truly afraid. Not just of Mike's death, but of what came after. His death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something we couldn't control. A strange transformation one morning. I woke up to find a strange item on my desk. An antique clock. It wasn't mine, but inside it was a tiny note. Written on it were the words, "Find the bridge. Don't let time run out in vain." My heart pounded as I read those words. It was a direct reference to the dreams, Jane's dream and the mysterious bridge. I stared at the clock, and a cold shiver ran through me. Mike didn't just want us to remember our promises. He wanted us to do something. Something we didn't yet understand. Mike's dreams had become a warning, and I sensed things were only going to get worse. His death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a relentless pursuit. Once the curse had been spoken, we couldn't escape it. We couldn't go back. What are we supposed to do now? The next day, after receiving the antique clock and the strange note, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept spinning with everything that had happened the night before. The dreams, the bizarre signs, and the letter with its ominous warning left me on edge. I stared at the clock, feeling that it wasn't just an old artifact. Everything seemed to be connected by something unexplainable, as if Mike was still out there, trying to make us fulfill the curse. I called Sarah and Jane, telling them to meet me immediately. They both heard the urgency in my voice, and though they were worried too, they agreed. We decided to gather at the old house I had just moved into, the place where everything had started to go wrong. The final meeting before everything turned horrific. When Sarah and Jane arrived, I had everything ready to show them, the clock and the undeniable signs. I began recounting every detail. The letter, the strange dreams. Jane, always the calmest among us, no longer looked composed. She stared at the clock in my hand with wary eyes, as if it could leap out and drag us into darkness. "We can't just sit here like this," Jane said after a long silence. "Something is definitely happening. Mike wants us to perform the curse, but it could be a trap." I didn't want to admit it, but part of me knew she was right. There was something in the air I couldn't escape, an oppressive presence. The dreams of Mike were no longer meaningless warnings. They were signs, footsteps leading us down a path we could never turn back from. Sarah stood and walked to the window, peering outside as if someone were watching. Her voice dropped. "I saw someone outside. It looked like Mike, but I can't be sure." Her words froze us. The room fell into a silence too heavy to describe. The dreams began on an unexpected night. Since that day, everything changed. Each night I saw Mike again in my dreams. But this time, they weren't simple echoes of the past. He didn't stand still like before. He moved through the shadows. His eyes were no longer the familiar eyes of our friend. Under the faint glow of the antique clock, his face took on a strange new form, something no longer human. "You can't keep running," Mike said, his voice cold and distant, nothing like the boy we once knew. "You made a promise, and now you must pay the price." I wanted to flee, but my legs were frozen. Trapped in this dreamscape of cold and gloom, I felt utterly helpless. I tried to call his name, but the sound was swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, measured, drawing closer behind me. The journey to the haunted bridge. The morning after that nightmare, I awoke with my mind still clouded, as if part of me was still trapped in the dream. I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that Mike wasn't just warning us. He wanted us to do something none of us truly understood. That afternoon, I decided to go to the bridge Jane had seen in her dreams. It wasn't far from my house, but it held a strange presence, as if it didn't belong in this time or place. The bridge was abandoned, rusted, its metal rails corroded, its stone foundation cracked. The sky above was gray, heavy, with the threat of rain. The air was thick, stagnant, like no living soul had passed through in ages. As we approached the bridge, Sarah suddenly stopped and stared ahead. "We shouldn't be here. Something feels wrong," she whispered, voice trembling. But I couldn't stop. Some strange force kept pulling me forward. Despite the dread growing inside me, I kept walking, as if something unseen was dragging me toward it. And then we saw it, a wooden stake driven into the ground near the center of the bridge. Beside it, a black cloth covering something. I bent down, pulled back the fabric, and underneath was a small wooden box, identical to the clock I had received. The curse creeps close. The moment I opened the box, a violent gust of wind surged past us, as if a supernatural force had just been unleashed. That feeling of being trapped returned with full force. I turned to look for Sarah and Jane, but they were gone. And then I knew. Mike was here, somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting for us to complete the curse. The words had already been spoken, and now there was no turning back. Time was running out, and Mike would not forgive us if we failed to keep the promise. The bridge had become a point of no return, and I knew, with every step forward, no matter what we did, we could never escape the curse. The tension clawed at me as I stood in the middle of the abandoned bridge, the wooden box still in my hands, strangely open, as if it were waiting for something. The air grew heavier by the second, choking the breath from my lungs. I had the distinct feeling that someone, was watching me, approaching. But I could only stand there, frozen in the stillness. Every sound around me had been devoured by the silence, leaving nothing but the prickling sensation crawling up my spine. And then I heard footsteps. At first they were faint, barely more than the whisper of wind, but they grew louder, clearer, echoing one by one, slow and deliberate. I turned, and there he was, Mike. But it wasn't the Mike I remembered. He was no longer the cheerful, joking friend. His face was distorted, pale, cracked like shattered glass. "It's time," Mike said, his voice raspy, inhuman. "You made a promise, and now you'll pay the price." I tried to step back, but my feet were rooted to the ground, paralyzed. The dread was overwhelming, numbing every sense. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The dreams, the curse, it was all real now. In this very moment, haunted by the past, as Mike drew closer, I felt the world around me begin to warp. The bridge, the distant houses, all of it grew hazy, as though swallowed by thick fog. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened like a noose. Fragments of the past, memories of laughter, of friendship, spun wildly in my head. He had once been my best friend, and now he was a ghost, a threat. Suddenly I felt a freezing hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah standing there, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "We can't let him drag us down any further," she whispered, voice trembling. "We have to stop this. That's not Mike. Not anymore." I looked at her, stunned, but there was no time to think. Mike was closing in. His footsteps echoed louder and louder, as if they were drowning out everything else. I realized then, we were all caught in a nightmare we couldn't control. Not just me, Sarah, Jane, all of us. The warning. "Mike, you can't do this," I said weakly, but he didn't react. He just stood there, unblinking, like a doll forgotten in the dark. Then, a voice rang out. Not from him, but from deep within the darkness, like something whispering from the depths of the earth. "Mike is dead," the voice echoed in my mind. "He is no longer himself. He's part of the curse now." My heart stopped. The truth unveiled itself, clear and brutal. Mike wasn't just a ghost. He was part of something larger, something supernatural. He had become an instrument of evil. And now we were the ones paying the price. The hidden door. "We need to break the curse," I said to Sarah, but she only shook her head, eyes filled with despair. "It's too late," she said. "Mike told us we have to pay." I turned to look at Mike. He was walking toward me, step by step. I had no weapons, no plan. But something strange stirred inside me, as if a hidden door had opened. An instinct told me, if we don't end this now, we'll be trapped forever. "We have to go back to the bridge," I said firmly, not knowing why, but believing it. When I looked into Sarah and Jane's eyes, I saw uncertainty, but also a sliver of trust. They didn't know what to do either, but somehow we all understood. If we didn't go back, we would never leave. The unexpected ending. The three of us walked across the bridge again, but this time, something felt different. Our footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, each one pulling us deeper into something unseen. Then, a flash of light appeared at the far end of the bridge. It wasn't sunlight. It wasn't headlights. It was something else. A tunnel. A passage to another world we couldn't understand. As we stepped toward it, a gust of wind surged past us carrying strange sounds, distant screams, voices twisted by the void. Then we stood before a massive wooden door. No keyhole, no markings, just a door that seemed to have been waiting for us. I knew this was it, the only way to break the curse. Mike's ghost stood behind us, eyes unfathomable, eyes filled with finality, vengeance. But I understood. Only by opening that door could we end this. The door creaked slowly open, a blast of cold air slamming into my face. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a curse. It was a battle for our lives, one we could no longer run from. Story 6. The Footsteps of Those Who Never Left. The house stood at the end of a long road, its path covered in dry leaves and dust. It wasn't a particularly remarkable house, But there was something undeniably strange about it. The Miller family, David, his wife Emma, and their two young children, Lily and Ben, had decided to move in, attracted by the low rent and its secluded location in the town of Hickory Grove, Ohio. They needed a fresh start, and this seemed like their only opportunity. David recalled their first day in the house, when sunlight streamed through the dusty window panes. The house retained its 1920s charm with old wooden furniture and a stone fireplace. Everything appeared normal, except for the antique paintings adorning the walls and an inexplicable chill in the air. David dismissed it, telling Emma, "It's just an old house." When she inquired about any oddities, the initial nights were eerily quiet, so silent that the air felt stagnant. Each night, after the children were asleep, Emma and David would sit together in the living room, sometimes in silence, occasionally hearing strange noises from within the walls, as if someone were moaning in the darkness. They initially attributed it to the wind whistling through the old window frames. But these sounds became more frequent, especially at night. On the third night, as everything lay in slumber, Emma abruptly awoke to an unmistakable sound. Footsteps, steady and heavy, as if someone was pacing the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, but upon opening her eyes, all was serene. She sat up, scanning the room, but saw nothing beyond the shadows. Surely it was just her imagination, but it wasn't. The next day, Emma decided to investigate. She wanted to uncover the source of the noises. Walking down the hallway, she checked each door. All were securely closed. But upon reaching the last room, the one the family had avoided, she sensed something amiss. The wooden door was decayed, with peculiar cracks on the handle, as if someone had tried to force it open from the outside. Emma hesitated to open it immediately, feeling an inexplicable urge. She returned to David and shared her findings. David laughed off her concerns, skeptical of anything supernatural, but agreed to open the door with her that evening. As night fell, the footsteps returned, clearer than ever, echoing through the stillness. The family sat in silence, listening to the heavy steps descending from upstairs. Emma, flashlight in hand, trembled as David held her hand and opened the room's door. Inside was a peculiar scene. Old family portraits, a tattered upholstered chair, and a wooden table. Most unsettling was a large painting hanging opposite the door. It was so aged that details were indistinct. But what terrified Emma and David were the eyes of the figures in the painting. They stared directly at them, as if they belonged to the living. David approached the painting, while Emma felt an inexplicable pull into the darkness. She detected a sweet, damp scent, reminiscent of undisturbed earth. When David touched the frame, the painting suddenly fell, crashing loudly. Behind it was another photograph of a different family, but their faces had been torn away, leaving only tattered remnants. A deep red stain smeared across it, forming the shape of a strange hand, as if someone had tried to conceal a truth. Emma couldn't bear it any longer. Her heart raced, vision blurred with fear. "David, something is terribly wrong here," she screamed. Before she could say more, the room's light extinguished. In the darkness, raspy breathing sounded right beside them. The family fled outside, not daring to look back at the house. Standing at the door, a chilling sensation enveloped them. They heard the footsteps again from within, steady, approaching them. The next morning, they returned to inspect. The house was as silent as before, but upon entering, the torn family photograph lay on the table, as if nothing had happened. No one dared cross that threshold again. The shadow of the curse lingered, and from that night on, the house never ceased its nocturnal footsteps. The next day, after the strange events of the night before, the Miller family tried to return to normal life, though that seemed impossible. Everything in the house remained quiet, but the atmosphere had shifted. A cold, lurking presence seeped through the old walls, like an invisible ghost waiting to pull them under. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the torn painting and the deep crimson stain. She tried to convince herself it might have just been an accident, a coincidence. But deep inside, unease was growing. Why had the painting been ripped apart like that? And where had the blood come from? David, on the other hand, dismissed those thoughts. He believed the family just needed time to get used to the old house, a place steeped in history. And eventually, everything would settle down. But at night, when darkness enveloped the home, the footsteps returned, echoing through the hallway, making it impossible for anyone to sleep. A week passed, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. Every night, Emma heard raspy breathing in the dark, as if someone was standing right next to her bed, right in front of her. But when she opened her eyes, there was only silence. One night, she awoke to see a shadowy figure standing outside her bedroom door. When she rushed to open it, no one was there. Anxiety weighed heavier on them with each passing day. And when night came, the footsteps echoed once more throughout the house. But this time, they weren't just harmless sounds. Something was different, deliberate, as if someone was walking toward them, not away. Lily and Ben, their sweet children, began showing signs of fear. Lily said she had seen a woman standing at the end of the hallway at night, her face pale white with glowing red eyes. And Ben, one morning, said he heard his name being called from the basement, even though no one was down there. Emma and David tried to learn more about the house's past. They visited the town library, searching for anything related to the abandoned home. After days of digging, Emma uncovered a strange story. The house had once belonged to the Thelma family, a reclusive clan shunned by the town due to whispered rumors of bizarre rituals performed inside their home. Mrs. Thelma, the family matriarch, was said to have conducted dark ceremonies within those walls. Locals claimed she had made a pact with a shadowy force in exchange for immortality. Every member of the Thelma family had died under mysterious circumstances. The house had remained empty for years, until the Millers moved in. Each passing night, the air inside the house grew heavier. The noises became clearer, stranger. One evening, as the family was having dinner in the kitchen, a loud crash rang out from the second floor. David rushed upstairs, assuming someone had dropped something, but the entire floor was empty. Only one door was ajar. The bedroom they had refused to enter since moving in. David decided to open it. The door creaked loudly, echoing through the still air. As he stepped inside, there was nothing out of place, only a biting chill and an unshakable unease. But as he moved deeper into the room, he noticed something odd. An old mirror hanging on the wall. It reflected his image, but his reflection wasn't standing upright. It was slouched forward, as if someone else was standing behind him. A cold shiver ran through David's body. He turned around but no one was there. His heart pounded, eyes scanning the room for something unseen. Then, from a dark corner, a quiet laugh echoed, soft but unmistakably real, as if someone were hiding behind the thick curtain of shadows. Emma and the kids heard David scream from downstairs and rushed up. But when they entered the room, David was gone. The room was empty. The mirror still hung on the wall, reflecting a hazy image of the space, as if something unseen was still lurking within. Emma searched for her husband the entire night, but he was nowhere to be found. Her sanity began to crack. The footsteps in the house grew closer, now moving outward from the darkness. She felt something dark and malevolent was following her, closer with every step. Meanwhile, Lily and Ben continued to hear their names being called from somewhere within the house. Voices only the children could hear. And when night fell, Emma would hear that same raspy breathing again from the corner of the living room, as if someone stood in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The haunting became unbearable. The Millers knew something terrible was unfolding within the house. And the more they tried to escape, the more they realized there was no way out of the curse tied to this forsaken place. The footsteps in the night never stopped. The next morning, as sunlight began to filter through the dust-covered windows, Emma realized her husband was gone. She searched the entire house, but David was nowhere to be found. The house remained eerily silent, as if nothing had happened, except for the strange traces left from the night before. The room where David had stood in front of the mirror was still empty, but something was deeply unsettling. The mirror continued to reflect the same room, even though no one was in it. Emma trembled as she stared at the mirror. She didn't know if what she was seeing was real, but there was something off about the light within the reflection. A shadow flickered, so fast it was almost imperceptible. Was it David? Or something else entirely? Unable to stay calm any longer, Emma turned and ran downstairs, where Lily and Ben sat huddled together, confused and afraid. Both children could feel the shift in the atmosphere of the house. Ben, with his clear, innocent eyes, said he felt like someone was watching him, even though no one was there. Lily, 10 years old, said she saw a shadow standing at the door to her parents' bedroom, but when she turned back, there was nothing. Emma looked at her children's faces and knew they couldn't stay here any longer. She made the decision to leave that very day, no matter what they had to leave behind. But just as she began to pack, the footsteps returned. This time, it wasn't just one or two. It was a sequence of heavy thuds, someone moving through the hallway, entering each room slow and relentless. Emma froze, eyes wide with fear. These sounds weren't caused by the wind. They weren't creaks of an old house. These footsteps had intent. They were coming closer. Lily and Ben gripped their mother's hands tightly. All three turned their gaze toward the dark hallway. Everything was still, but the footsteps kept going, echoing clearly. They moved down the hall, then stopped, just outside the living room where the family stood. Step by step, heavier and closer. Suddenly, the front door creaked open by itself, startling them. The old hinges groaned as it swung wide, revealing the darkness outside. At that moment, a piercing chill spread through the house. The atmosphere shifted from silence to suffocating pressure, as if something invisible was flooding the space. Emma felt someone standing behind her. She spun around. No one was there. Then it escalated. From within the mirror, the shadow appeared again. At first, it was just a faint blur, but gradually, it took shape. A silhouette of a woman, her long hair hanging down, her face obscured. The figure began to move, slowly stepping out of the mirror, as though the shadow was entering reality. "Run!" Emma screamed, her voice trembling. Lily and Ben dashed toward the door, but just as they reached the threshold, a loud slam echoed through the house. The door had slammed shut. They were trapped. Emma turned around, sensing the freezing presence at her back. She faced the mirror, and the figure was there, now clearer, her face visible, her eyes burning red with hatred and sorrow. The ghost stepped out fully from the mirror, but didn't approach them. She stood still, staring directly at Emma. Then she opened her mouth and spoke in a hoarse, broken voice. Unlike any sound Emma had ever heard. "The curse of this house has never ended, and you will be the next." Emma froze. Her body turned to ice. She couldn't breathe. The words echoed in her mind, pulling her into a dark spiral with no way out. Lily and Ben stood motionless, too afraid to move. But then, a faint light began to flicker behind the ghost, as if an unseen force was trying to drive it away. The glow grew stronger, pushing against the darkness. But the ghost didn't budge. "Go, now!" Emma screamed again, grabbing her children and pulling them toward the door. Refusing to look back, they burst outside. The cold wrapped around them like a shroud. Inside the house, the footsteps began again. Even though they had escaped, there was no denying it. The house had marked them. The ghost was not finished. It was waiting. Emma turned back to look. The house was now just a shadow beneath the afternoon light. Still silent, but in her heart, she knew this was not the end. The darkness of that house was still watching. The curse had never lifted, and the footsteps in the night would follow them forever. Story 7. The Drowned Spirit. Searching for a substitute. Everything started after Brandon's funeral. His death was an unimaginable shock, not just to me, but to everyone else in our group. That night we sat together, trying to find comfort in our memories of a friend we had trusted and loved. But something felt off. Even though we had laid him to rest, I couldn't shake the feeling that Brandon wasn't truly gone. It was as if something still lingered in the air. From that night on, I started having strange sensations. Every night, when the moonlight streamed into my room, I would see a shadowy figure standing at the window, looking in. Those eyes that could send chills down anyone's spine, looked weak, pleading. Story 7. The Drowned Spirit. Searching for a substitute, didn't want to believe what I saw, but deep down, I knew it was Brandon. He stood there silently, his eyes filled with sorrow and despair. At first, I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid I was imagining things, and I tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination. But the figure returned, night after night, becoming clearer and more detailed. I tried to sleep, but those eyes followed me, refusing to leave. Each morning, I'd wake up exhausted, as though something was pressing down on both my body and soul. Soon, I began to notice even stranger signs. Items in my house started moving inexplicably. One time, I found the antique clock that I always kept on the desk lying in the middle of the floor. Cold gusts of air began to flow through the room without reason, making me feel like an unseen presence was always nearby. And then I saw something I would never forget. One evening, as I sat by the window, I saw Brandon again. But this time, he didn't just stand still. He moved closer to the window. His sorrowful eyes locked onto mine, and his lips began to move as if trying to speak. No sound came out. I wanted to call his name, to run and open the door, but an invisible force held me in place. My entire body was frozen. That moment etched itself into my mind, impossible to separate from. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to see Michael, one of Brandon's closest friends, to tell him what I'd been experiencing. Michael was a grounded person, not one to be easily spooked. But after I told him everything, he fell silent. After a long pause, he said just one thing: "Don't let it take you." Michael understood Brandon's pain more than anyone. They had a deep bond, and I knew he too was haunted by Brandon's death. But his warning unsettled me. That night, I decided to visit Brandon's grave, hoping for answers to the strange events that had taken over my life. The sky was pitch black, and a cold wind blew through the cemetery. Brandon's grave was tucked away in a secluded corner, far from where anyone would usually go. A strange stillness surrounded the area. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming loneliness, as if something was pulling me toward Brandon's grave. I knelt down, placed my hand on the stone, and in that instant, I heard a soft whisper right beside my ear. "Replace me." The words sent chills through my spine. I didn't want to believe what I'd just heard, but the sensation was undeniable. In that moment, I realized Brandon's death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something. A cycle that refused to stop. The next night, I couldn't sleep. Those eyes, that shadow, still lingering, still waiting for a response. Something inside me began to change. I didn't feel like myself anymore. It was as if part of my soul had been taken, making room for something else. And then one night, as I sat alone in my room, a familiar voice echoed from the shadows. "I can't leave. You have to take my place." I turned around, and this time, Brandon wasn't at the window. He was standing right in front of me. His face sunken, his eyes hollow with desperation. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. Something had already begun to take control, and I could feel the grip of a soul unwilling to let go. Can I escape this haunting? Can I find a way to free myself from the chains of death and the spirit seeking a replacement? These questions keep spinning in my mind, but I know one thing for certain. I can't stop now. The journey has begun, and there's no turning back. And so the darkness closes in around me. The air thickens with every breath, because once the drowned soul finds a replacement, the haunting will never end. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling, as if an invisible shadow was pressing down on my body. The faint light of dawn crept through the crack in the door, casting a pale glow over my tired face in the mirror. Every morning, I wished what I had experienced was just a nightmare. But everything I saw, everything I felt, remained vividly intact. I tried to convince myself that I would stop chasing those strange signs. I couldn't keep living in fear. But just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard a soft tapping on the window. It was so light, it could have been the wind, but it made me jump. This time I didn't dare look. Brandon's presence had become inseparable from me. He was like a ghost, clinging to me, haunting me, always watching. I told myself I wouldn't let the obsession take over. But when I stepped outside and walked down the street, a strange sensation hit me again. People around me didn't seem to notice me at all. They walked by, chatting and laughing, never looking in my direction. I started to feel invisible, like I no longer existed in their world. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by a whisper inside my head. Replace me. The chill that ran through me was unbearable. I turned and hurried home, where everything seemed the same. But not everything. I felt it again. Someone was there. Not someone. Brandon? That feeling, like a cold hand reaching from the darkness, brushing against every hair on my body. Just then, I got a call from Michael. His voice was rushed, urgent. "You need to come to my house now. Something's wrong." I could hear the fear in his tone. I didn't hesitate. I drove straight to Michael's place. When I arrived, the front door was ajar. I stepped inside, but there was no one. The house was unnervingly silent. Michael wasn't in the living room. He wasn't in the kitchen either. I called out to him. No response. As I walked through the hallway, a sudden chill swept over me, bone deep, paralyzing. I'd felt this before, at home, whenever Brandon was near, or whatever was left of him. I pushed deeper into the house and finally found Michael. He was standing in his study, but something was wrong. He was staring at a painting on the wall, his eyes vacant, as if unaware of my presence. I stepped closer and grabbed his shoulder. "Michael, what's going on?" No reaction. He stood frozen. Eventually, he turned to face me, and the moment I saw his eyes, I knew. They weren't Michael's anymore. They were hollow, lifeless, empty of any soul. "I can't stop." His voice echoed, but not from his mouth. It sounded like it came from somewhere far away, from inside me. "I have to replace." That was when I understood. Something horrific was happening. Brandon wasn't just haunting me. He was taking the people I loved. His death hadn't been the end. It was a curse, a never-ending cycle, where the drowned come back looking for a replacement. When I looked into Michael's eyes again, I didn't see my friend. Brandon had taken him. He was the next piece in this deadly game. I couldn't stay still. I had to do something to break the cycle. But the signs kept coming. The presence of Brandon crept into every corner of the space around me. I knew I was running out of time. I bolted out of the house, desperate to escape the fear tightening around me. But outside, the air felt thick, suffocating. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. And then I heard it. A soft breath. Someone was standing close. I turned. And this time, it wasn't just a flicker in the dark. Brandon stood there, but not the friend I once knew. He had changed. His face distorted. His eyes, no longer human. He stared at me. And then he opened his mouth, revealing a smile that defied description. Something monstrous. Something waiting for me to accept my fate. "I've replaced," Brandon whispered. His voice was dry, hollow, like it came from the bottom of a grave. "Now it's your turn." And just as I realized what he meant, the darkness swallowed me whole. My soul was being pulled into a spiral with no escape. I don't know how I woke up. When my eyes opened, I found myself lying in a dark room, the cold pressing in around me so deeply, it felt like I had just crawled out of a grave. The chill seeped into every inch of my flesh, bringing a stinging ache that made me wince. I tried to move, but my body felt bound, secured not to a real bed, but to a slab of freezing wood. Everything around me was shadowy, lifeless. Not a single sound, not a single motion. And then I heard the whisper. "You can't run." The voice was soft, but its coldness cut through me like a blade. In that instant, I realized I wasn't in my house anymore. I didn't know where I had been taken, but the sensation, the feeling of being held in darkness, was one I had grown used to ever since Brandon began haunting me. It was as if reality itself had fractured, and I could no longer find a way out of this obsession. I tried to struggle, but my strength was useless. Everything began to blur, like I was sinking deeper into a bottomless void. That was when I heard it again. Another sound. This time, footsteps, slow, measured, relentless. When I forced my eyes open again, I saw a figure standing before me. Michael. He had been my closest friend, but the look in his eyes was no longer familiar. His gaze was hollow, empty, as if whatever soul had once lived in him had long since vanished. He stared straight at me, and I knew he had already been taken. Michael stepped closer, each footfall echoing in the still room like some kind of twisted lullaby. "I've been here, and now it's your turn," he said, his voice cold as raindrops falling on stone. Before I could respond, a sudden pain tore through my chest. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, like my soul was being ripped apart piece by piece. I gasped, desperate to resist it, but the pain didn't let go. It spread through me, relentless, like something invisible was draining the life out of me. "Don't try to run," Michael said again. This time, he no longer called me his friend. I was just another victim. "You'll never escape. We're trapped here, forever." I tried to pull my hands free from the wooden slab, but I couldn't. Invisible binds wrapped around my wrists, holding me in place. Beneath me, the ground began to tremble, and I realized it wasn't a normal floor. Beneath me was a pit, a dark, bottomless void. I screamed, but no sound escaped. Dark shapes stretched out around me, like invisible hands reaching to wrap around my limbs. One question echoed through my mind. Can I get out of this? Is there a way to end the cycle? Brandon's spirit hadn't just taken over Michael. It was coming for me too. His death hadn't been the end. It was the beginning of something horrific. He wanted me to take his place, to let the loop continue. And then, just when I thought I might suffocate in the dark, I felt a wave of cold air sweep over me. A new figure appeared. But this one wasn't familiar. It was a woman. She had long black hair and eyes as dark as night, emotionless and still. She said nothing. She just stood there, watching me. I knew instantly. She wasn't human. There was something about her presence, something unnatural. She stepped closer, and with every movement the air around her turned colder. "You're not the first," she said, her voice like a wind whispering through the trees, yet heavy, with ominous clarity. Brandon wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. Her words jolted something inside me. What she said, it made sense. This wasn't a string of random events. It was a curse, ancient and deliberate. And Brandon, Michael, and now me. We were pawns in a game we didn't understand. A loop that refused to end. She reached out, and a freezing gust enveloped me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It felt like my soul was being pulled from my body, dragged toward a hidden space I couldn't see. "Do you want to escape?" she asked. Her eyes still unreadable. All I could do was nod, because I knew if I didn't find a way out now, I would be trapped in this cycle forever. She smiled, a slight knowing smile, as if she had been waiting for that answer all along. Then you must make a choice. And just as her words ended, a loud noise erupted behind me. I turned, and there he was, Brandon. He was walking toward me, tears in his eyes. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Something inside me had shifted. I knew, if I didn't act now, I would become part of the loop, forever. You can't escape, Brandon whispered, his voice broken. But you can replace me. Story 8, Spirit Game, The Chosen Must Die. It all began on a chilly autumn evening when my group of friends decided to try a game we'd heard about through eerie stories shared during our late-night gatherings. The Ouija board. At first, it was just a fun idea, something to kill time over the weekend. But none of us knew that it would be the decision that would drag us into a nightmare beyond imagination. That night, I was with my 4 closest friends, Jason, Mia, Eric, and Linda, gathered at Jason's house. His home, an old manor on the outskirts of town, hadn't been renovated in years. Cracks crawled across the walls, and the fogged windows seemed to hold secrets from the past. The room we sat in was especially dark, as the single antique lamp hanging from the ceiling barely lit the corners. "Wanna try the Ouija board?" Mia, always the one drawn to the mysterious, asked with a gleam in her eye. "It'll be fun. We've never done it before." Linda and I sat in silence. It wasn't that we didn't want to join. It was just that something in the air felt off, unsettling. But under the daring stares of Jason and Eric, I couldn't say no. We formed a circle, a small wooden table between us. On it sat an old, worn-out Ouija board. Unlike the ones you see online, with clean printed letters and symbols, this one was handmade, its surface scratched and faded, like a relic from another era. To me, it looked like something that didn't belong in this world, and it carried a dreadful aura. Mia picked up the glass cup, her hand trembling as she placed it on the board. She began to chant a spell she'd found in an old book gifted by a friend. "Spirit, if you are present, please come forth." She read in a steady, almost prayer-like tone. We stayed silent, watching Mia's every movement. Nothing happened. The room remained still. Jason shrugged. Probably read it wrong, but Mia insisted. "Let's wait a little longer." She read another incantation from the book, and then, just as she finished, something strange happened. The glass started to move, slowly gliding across the board. First slowly, then faster and faster, as though pulled by an unseen force. We all froze, barely breathing. I looked into my friends' eyes and saw the rising panic reflected in them. "It's not us, right?" Eric whispered, his voice shaky. This isn't a prank." The board began to tremble slightly. Then the glass stopped, completely still, pointing to a single letter. We read one word, unmistakably clear: "Me." My heart pounded. A chill spread through my body. No one spoke, but the air around us had changed. Mia's face turned pale as she muttered an apology under her breath. We stood up, walked away from the board, and turned off the light. That night I couldn't sleep. Strange images lingered in my mind. The letters, the cup, and that word. Me? The feeling of being watched, being followed, grew stronger. I couldn't shake it. The next morning, everything seemed normal. But I was wrong. The deaths began. One by one. Jason was the first. He vanished without a trace. The last time we saw him, he was sitting in the living room, eyes hollow, staring at something none of us could see. Then Linda. She died in a bizarre car accident. Her vehicle flipped in an unnatural way, with no sign of impact. I remember her last words, her voice hoarse and terrified. Someone's behind me, a shadow. Then Mia died from a nightmare, but it wasn't a normal death. She died in her sleep, her face frozen in horror, as if she had seen something unspeakable. Everything around her, even her bed, was torn apart like a storm had hit. All of their deaths had one terrifying thing in common. No visible physical cause. They all died in sheer terror. But what horrified me even more was what I discovered afterward. Eric and I were the only ones left. We realized the deaths weren't coincidences. They were tied to the spirits we had awakened. Spirits imprisoned for centuries, now returned to reclaim what was once theirs. We had made a mistake no one could undo. And now, all we could do was face the consequences of playing the Ouija board the wrong way. The days following Mia's death felt like a nightmare with no end. Each morning, I woke up hoping it had all been just a dream. But when I looked in the mirror and saw my hollow eyes, the pale reflection staring back at me, I knew it wasn't a dream. It was a terrifying reality. Eric and I could no longer bear to stay in Jason's house. The fear and strangeness still lingered in every corner, in every wall, as if death itself was still haunting the air. Every time I entered the living room, I felt an invisible pull, as if something in the darkness was watching me. It wasn't ordinary fear. It was deeper, a suffocating dread, a sense that death had not left us. What are we supposed to do? Eric sat across from me, his eyes full of worry. We can't live like this forever. I looked at him, then at the table where we had once placed the Ouija board. A vague thought flickered in my mind. Maybe we have to go back, find out what caused all these deaths. Eric nodded, his eyes filled with hope. But I could still see the fear he tried to hide. We had no choice but to return to the place where we had awakened the angry spirits. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt something was waiting for us there. Like we had walked into a trap long ago and never realized it. We decided to return to Jason's mansion. That night, the silence around us felt unnatural. Neither of us spoke during the drive, but the tension in the car was thick enough to cut with a knife. The world outside was still, but deep down I knew we weren't chasing the truth anymore. We were running, and the further we ran, the deeper we sank into a darkness we couldn't escape. When we arrived, the mansion looked the same. The air was just as heavy as when we'd left. Nothing had changed, except one thing. The house felt forgotten, as if time no longer touched it. A coldness blanketed everything, and even though we had nowhere else to go, part of me wanted to turn around and flee. We stepped inside. The living room was still. Everything was as we had left it. Chairs out of place. Signs of that horrible night still clearly visible. But something was missing. The Ouija board. The room was now empty, swallowed by deepening shadows. "We have to find it," Eric said, his voice trembling, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "We need to know where it is." I didn't argue. Even though every instinct in me screamed to leave, something forced me to stay. I knew, unless we saw this through, we would never be free. We searched the entire house, from top to bottom. Every door was shut tight. There was no sign, The board had been moved. But then, as we neared the basement, I heard it. A strange sound, like someone gently knocking on the wall. We froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Eric pointed toward the basement door. "We have to go down there." There was no other choice. I nodded. We opened the door. A musty, damp odor rushed out to meet us, and the cold seeped into our bones. Below was a long, dark staircase with no light except for the faint outlines of old, forgotten objects. The fear grew stronger with every step. I could feel something waiting for us down there. We descended into the basement. The flashlight in my hand barely lit more than a few feet around us. And then the beam landed on something in the corner, something dark. Still, the Ouija board. It lay there on the damp concrete floor as if it had never been moved. But what made me shudder was the writing on it. Letters smeared across the surface. Not in ink, in blood. A message, a warning. You should not have returned. I couldn't breathe. A wave of panic gripped me. Eric and I locked eyes. We didn't have to say anything. We understood. We had awakened the spirits, and now they wanted revenge. Suddenly, a sound echoed behind me. I spun around, just in time to see a shadow dart past. My vision blurred, and when I looked again, Eric was gone. The room went still. Too still. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay. They were getting closer. I turned and ran toward the stairs, but there was no way out. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed inside my mind, like a curse. As I bolted out of the basement, unable to look back, I felt an invisible force pulling me backward, back toward that dark house. The air grew heavier with every step, and cold winds swirled around me like invisible hands pushing me deeper into danger. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard, I feared it might burst at any moment. My whole body trembled, and my legs felt glued to the ground, frozen in place. I scrambled up the stairs, rushing toward the front door. But just as I reached it, the door slammed shut right in front of me. A strange sound echoed through the air, like someone was breathing softly and steadily, somewhere in the dark. How do we escape?" I whispered, my eyes wide, searching for a way out. But there was none. Inside the mansion, everything turned blurry. Strange noises rang out endlessly, like the sound of death drawing near. I turned around one last time, hoping to see Eric somewhere in the darkness. But he wasn't there, only me, alone in this house, like prey waiting to be devoured. I turned and pounded my fists against the wall, hoping for help, but all that came back was my own echo. No answer, nothing. A chill deeper than anything I'd felt before crept into my bones. It was as if the spirits had awakened, and they no longer sought revenge. They were hunting. In that moment of panic, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, threatening. They came from behind me, slow and steady. I turned, my eyes narrowing in fear. And then I saw it. A blurry silhouette approaching from the shadows. It was Eric's figure. "Eric?" I called softly, my voice trembling, but he didn't answer. The darkness closed in around us and the figure grew clearer. I saw his eyes. But they weren't the eyes I remembered. They were hollow, void of light, two bottomless pits that stared at me, not with love, but with something far worse than death. "Eric, you're not Eric," I screamed, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The figure's footsteps continued, slow but unstoppable. Suddenly, another sound echoed, like a door creaking open from somewhere deep within the house. I turned and ran toward the noise, hoping for an escape, but everything was swallowed in darkness. I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going until I froze. A voice, soft, whispered inside my head. How can you escape? It wasn't Eric, not Mia, not Linda, not Jason. It was a voice I'd never heard before, dry and cold, as though it had been born from the very heart of the darkness itself. I realized, horrified, that I had been drawn into a game with no way out. A game orchestrated by spirits awakened from the Ouija board. They no longer wanted to play. They wanted control. And then, from the shadows, I heard laughter. A cruel, mocking laugh, like someone was watching me at my weakest. My heart thrashed wildly. I tried to run, but every path led into more darkness. The laughter grew louder. I turned toward it and I saw her. A woman wearing a long white dress, her jet black hair dragged across the ground. But her eyes were black voids, empty and endless. She stood there, staring at me with cold hatred. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard whispers, curses I couldn't understand. The shadow moved closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The air around me thinned, suffocating me. Her footsteps echoed, soft but deadly. I felt her breath freezing cold, brushing my skin. "You will pay," she finally said, her voice now clear, sharp. "The game has only just begun." And then, everything was consumed by darkness. The woman's shadow vanished, but her laughter still echoed through the air. I felt trapped, completely ensnared by a force I couldn't fight. The mansion itself seemed to shrink, like everything inside was being pulled into some invisible space. I looked at the sealed doors, the unmoving walls, and I felt it, a force from within, dragging me into another world, a world of death, of vengeful spirits. I didn't know what to do anymore. These spirits didn't just want revenge, they wanted us. Our souls, mine, Eric's, all of ours, and I realized I was no longer a player in this Ouija game. I was the prey, and the game had only just begun. Story 9. Never Turn Your Back, the invitation from the dark. I remember that night vividly, the night I took part in that strange, twisted challenge. It started out innocently enough, like a simple game between close friends. But then it turned into a nightmare I could never forget. We had gathered at Lisa's old house, a vintage-style home on the outskirts of the city, where the air always felt heavy and suffocating. The neighboring houses were just as old, standing silently like stone witnesses to the passing of time. Lisa often told us eerie stories about her house, that it had been the site of strange events, unexplainable deaths no one could make sense of. But we didn't care much. To us, it was the perfect place to try the Don't Turn Around game. The story behind this game had been passed down for generations. It supposedly originated in the 1800s, when people would gather on dark nights to test their courage. According to legend, the participant had to stand alone in a pitch-black room and say the phrase, "I am not afraid." If they turned around, something not of this world, would pull them into another space, a place from which no one had ever returned. "Come on, it'll be fine," Lisa said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. She was the one who introduced the game, and the rest of us, our close-knit group of friends, couldn't say no. The room we chose for the challenge was upstairs, in a part of the house untouched by light. We stood at the doorway peering into the inky darkness. No one wanted to be the first. The air was thick with tension. The faint glow from the single hallway light cast warped shadows into the room. Everyone was silent. Though no one admitted it, we were all uneasy. "All right, I'll go first," Lisa said, stepping into the room without hesitation. She quickly positioned herself in the center, looked directly at us, and uttered the words we would never forget. "I'm not afraid." Then she turned around, facing the darkness. We stayed at the door, watching, waiting to see what would happen. Seconds dragged by like centuries. We could no longer see Lisa clearly, but something about the air felt off. A pressure began to build in my chest, like something unseen was bearing down on me. Then silence. Stillness. Lisa didn't move. We called her name, but she didn't respond. A chill ran down my spine. My heart pounded as my eyes remained fixed on the shadows in the room. "Lisa," I called out, my voice trembling. We didn't dare go in. If we did, would we be able to come back out? Then something strange happened. The hallway light flickered, and in that fleeting moment, I heard an eerie noise from the darkness. A sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor. When the light steadied again, Lisa was gone. The door had quietly closed, as if no one had entered or left. We stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. No one spoke. All eyes were locked on the door. "Lisa?" I called again, but this time no answer came. Just then, the window at the end of the hallway blew open, and a cold gust rushed in. We stood paralyzed, the sensation of being watched settling over us like a fog. The space around us felt twisted, distorted. Everything began to blur, as if we were being pulled into a different world. Suddenly, I felt a strong force from behind, like an invisible hand reaching out from the dark. I turned, but before I could make sense of it, my legs started moving toward the blackened room against my will. Just as I crossed the threshold, Jack, another friend, grabbed my arm. "Don't go in! It's pulling us in!" he shouted, panic in his voice. I didn't understand what was happening. Everyone else began to flee down the hallway. Everyone except me. I could feel something invisible yanking at me, and yet I couldn't move. I heard someone's ragged breathing close by, and then a voice, soft, almost gentle, whispered in my mind, "You won't be coming back." I couldn't resist. And then everything around me went dark, consumed by a suffocating blackness. When I woke up, I was no longer in Lisa's house. The cold seeped into my skin, making me shiver awake. My head felt hazy, as if I had just stepped out of a long, mysterious nightmare. The air around me was dense and frigid, cloaked in a fog, so thick it felt alive. I looked up, trying to make sense of my surroundings, only to find myself in a darkness far deeper than I had ever imagined. At first, I thought I was still in Lisa's room. But no, I realized quickly. This was somewhere completely different. The room I was in had no windows, just a single closed door. The musty stench stung my nose, and the heavy air carried a stillness that spoke of a place untouched by life for far too long. I stood up, my mind still spinning, and walked toward the door. But as I reached out to touch it, I felt something, some unseen force, pushing back, resisting me. A vague fear rose inside me, but I shook it off and forced the door open. The sight beyond made me stagger. It wasn't a normal hallway as I had hoped. but a long, pitch-black corridor stretching into infinity. The walls were cracked, long, jagged lines running along them like wounds that would never heal. Strange sounds echoed from the far end, as if something was moving. Slowly, deliberately, a sharp pain pierced my skull, as if something unseen was squeezing my mind. A creeping dread coiled around my chest. I had to find Lisa. I couldn't just leave her behind in this place. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway, even as fear wrapped itself tightly around me. The further I walked, the colder it became. A thin mist began to rise from the floor, curling around my ankles. I kept moving forward, endlessly, with no end in sight. Beneath my feet, the ground seemed to pulse, like footsteps out of sync with my own. Behind me, the sounds grew louder. Something was moving. Slowly, but steadily. I stopped, turned around. Nothing, no one. My breath caught in my throat. No, this isn't real, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But something inside me knew. I was being watched. Two invisible eyes locked onto me, following every step I took. The sound came again, this time, right beside my ear. I spun around, heart hammering, just in time to glimpse a blurred figure vanish into the shadows. I screamed, but no sound came out. Panic swallowed me whole. I was frozen in place, unable to move. I didn't understand what was happening. Everything felt like it was unraveling, pulling me into an endless void. I turned to go back, but the door I had opened was gone. In its place, a solid wall. The hallway around me dissolved into pure darkness, offering no support, no way back. My mind reeled. One question echoed in my skull, over and over. What did I do? I panted, trying to think clearly. All I remembered was standing in Lisa's dimly lit room. I turned my back, and now I was here. What had I done wrong? What was the price of turning away? The questions crashed into me like waves, threatening to break me. I needed to understand. I needed to know if there was still a way out. Then, a voice emerged from the darkness, soft but powerful. You cannot leave, it whispered. You can only go forward. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That voice. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was cold, haunting. And when I looked ahead, I saw that I wasn't standing in a hallway anymore. I was surrounded by an endless black expanse, like the center of a bottomless swamp. A terrifying silence pressed in from all sides, so complete I could hear every beat of my heart. And then, shapes began to appear, faint, flickering figures drifting through the darkness. Some looked familiar. Friends, maybe, but they were all distorted, twisted, as if being dragged away by something unseen. Lisa? I called out softly. No answer, only the faceless spirits drifting past, oblivious to my existence. Then I realized these weren't my friends. They were souls trapped here, just like me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew if I didn't escape, I'd become one of them. A nameless, voiceless ghost wandering this horrific space forever. I'm not afraid, I whispered, as if those words were a spell or a command, but I didn't know if they had any power. The fear inside me kept rising. I couldn't stand still anymore. I had to move. My eyes widened. I couldn't let the darkness consume me. There was only one way left. Forward. I walked endlessly, step by step, through a space with no end. Around me, hazy silhouettes floated like headless, wandering souls, swirling in the bitter wind. A choking sensation wrapped around me, making every step feel eternal. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving forward because I knew deep down, if I ever turned back, I would never escape. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I realized these shapes were not my old friends. They were trapped souls, those who had entered this game before me. Now, they were nothing more than shadows bound to this realm, unable to leave, unable to return. Their faces were warped, twisted, their eyes dull and lifeless, like ghosts without a place to go. One shadow approached me. I couldn't look away. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her dark hair hanging loose around her, but her face was hidden beneath a thick veil of black mist. She floated closer, her feet never touching the ground. A wave of icy air slammed into me as she neared, and a gust of wind cut my breath short. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice soft like a lullaby, yet laced with warning. "But you will regret it, like all of us have." I didn't answer. Deep down, I knew she was right. Everything around me was changing, warping. The space was consuming me. Each step became heavier, each breath a battle, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't let myself be trapped here. A strange sound rose behind me. Not footsteps this time, but a scraping noise like something clawing at a surface. I turned around, and I saw it. A shadow, massive and shapeless, crawling toward me. It wasn't human. It was a thick black mass, like a storm cloud, moving like a predator through the dark. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. Every time I did, it was closer, always closer, pursuing me without rest. I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Each step was agony, like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from that thing. Suddenly, a faint light appeared ahead. I couldn't believe my eyes. A light, real and warm, like the edge of a door out of this world. I ran toward it, my legs aching with every step, but I didn't stop. I could feel the dark shape right behind me, ready to devour me whole. The light grew stronger, and then I saw it. A door, a massive door carved with strange symbols and swirling patterns like ancient runes. The only door in this space. I reached out, heart pounding with hope and fear. I had to escape. I couldn't let this place consume me. But as my hand touched the handle, a jolt of energy surged through my body. A sharp, painful shock, like the door was rejecting me. I pulled my hand away, disoriented and afraid. Could I open it? Could I really leave this place? I looked back at the black mass. A cold wind swept through me. I couldn't hesitate any longer. I had to face it. The shadow was right behind me now. I felt its freezing breath on my neck. I turned and saw it forming into a clearer shape. A monstrous creature, huge claws like blades, a faceless head with deep black grooves where eyes should have been. It smiled, and I heard the raspy voice in my head. "You cannot escape." You turned back. I didn't know what to do, but something became clear. I had to stop running. I had to face it. I stood tall. Something strange stirred inside me. A flicker of light lit up in my vision, and I felt stronger, like something was lending me power. I wasn't afraid anymore. I realized the only way out was through fear itself. I stared at the shadow, unflinching. It paused, as if waiting. And then, with one final breath, I lunged into the darkness, into the unclear space. into the place with no escape. A scream pierced the silence. Then everything faded. Only darkness remained. Story 10. The eyes that don't belong to my baby. The hospital room was silent, bathed in a pale bluish light from the overhead lamp, casting faint shadows on the white tiled floor. The only sound was the ticking of the clock, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of someone waiting. Sarah Morgan opened her eyes. It felt like she was waking from a long, heavy dream. Her head was spinning, and she couldn't tell how much time had passed. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her abdomen stopped her cold. That sensation, it felt like something inside her had changed forever. Sarah, are you awake? David's voice, her husband, was full of worry. He sat beside the bed, eyes red and weary from lack of sleep. A damp cloth was in his hand, which he quickly set down when he saw her awake. David? Sarah whispered, trying to raise her hand to her face. Everything felt foggy, unreal. She felt like a stranger in her own body. Her sweat-soaked hair clung to the back of her neck, and even her skin no longer felt like her own. You're okay, right? David asked, his face a mixture of concern and relief. Sarah looked at him, but there was something distant in her eyes, something unrecognizing. All she felt was a strange emptiness in her soul, like a bottomless pit. A feeling, both foreign and deeply real. She couldn't remember everything, but there was one thing that troubled her, something she couldn't explain. Where's our baby? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is the baby, David? David smiled, but it was forced, unnatural. The baby's right here, Sarah. Don't worry. Everything's fine. He turned to his left, toward a pale pink cradle sitting silently nearby. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a baby lying inside, arms gently waving. The child had smooth skin, closed eyes, and soft brown hair. But as Sarah looked at the baby's face, a chill ran through her body. She stared at the baby's closed eyes, and then, suddenly, the image of another woman, a stranger, flashed through her mind. A woman with cold, emotionless eyes. A face she didn't recognize, but that felt eerily familiar. Hauntingly so. She stood there, smiling faintly, as if watching Sarah's every move. No, Sarah gasped, hands trembling as she brought them to her face. No. Who is she? Why do I see her? David stood up, rushing to her side, arms outstretched to steady her as she looked faint. What's wrong, Sarah? What did you see? Sarah shook her head, her face pale with confusion. She's in the baby's eyes. In the baby's eyes. David looked at her, eyes filled with concern, and a flicker of something else. Something unreadable. He glanced at the baby in the cradle, then back at his wife. Sarah, you're just exhausted. The baby's just a baby. You're hallucinating. But Sarah couldn't see it that way. Every time she looked into the baby's eyes, she felt something was wrong. As if something, was looking back at her. The baby's eyes weren't the ones she had hoped for. She saw the woman's face more clearly now. Fear began to grip Sarah. She felt something terrible, something unnatural, was haunting the baby. She tried to suppress it, but couldn't. Her mind filled with chaotic images, blurred memories of another child, another woman. A collision between past and present, between the fragments of a strange, unfamiliar memory. She sat back on the bed, clutching her head, eyes wide with confusion and fear. All she wanted now was an answer, but all she got in return was silence, an eerie, bone-chilling silence. David watched his wife, his hands trembling as he saw the change in her. He didn't understand, couldn't explain what was happening. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked. But his voice felt empty. A question without a real answer, drowned by the growing fear inside him. And then a strange sound echoed in the room. A soft whisper, faint and unclear, as if someone was speaking. But Sarah couldn't make out the words. She looked around, sensing a presence she couldn't explain. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with terror, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. David heard nothing, but he saw the panic in her eyes. "You just need rest, Sarah. Everything will be fine." But in that moment, Sarah knew nothing would be fine, and the image of the woman in her baby's eyes would never leave her. Every day, Sarah battled a strange unease when facing her child. Though she knew the baby was her daughter, every time she looked into the child's eyes, images she couldn't explain flooded her mind. Eyes that were emotionless, cold, menacing. And above all, the image of that woman. A woman Sarah couldn't name, but felt she had met before, at a time and place she couldn't remember. The nightmares didn't stop, not just because of the bizarre images reflected in her child's gaze, but because of the strange phenomena haunting her house. On quiet nights, whispers echoed from within the walls, as if someone were hissing from the darkness. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, echoed during the late hours when the whole house should have been asleep. And when Sarah asked David if he heard anything, he just shook his head and told her she needed rest. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking in the house, waiting. One evening, when David went out to buy medicine for her, she sat alone in the room, trying to get a grip on things. She didn't know what she had done wrong, but her sense of dread only grew stronger. The strange visions of the woman wouldn't leave her alone, haunting her mind whenever she looked at the child. Sarah shook her head, forcing herself to focus on her tasks, but her daughter's eyes pulled her back. Suddenly, a soft cry echoed through the air, like the whimper of a baby. Sarah shot up, her heart pounding. She looked around the room. There was no one but her and the sleeping child in the cradle. But the cry, it was so clear. How could that be? The baby wasn't crying. She was sleeping soundly. Yet the sound drew closer, as if it were coming from inside the room itself. Sarah couldn't sit still any longer. She rose, her breath shallow and hurried, eyes scanning the room in confusion. She stepped toward the door, but before she could open it, a chilling wind swept in, so cold it made her shudder. The door creaked softly, then suddenly opened, pushed by an unseen force. Beyond the door was no longer the hallway of her home, but a long, shadowed corridor, like the wing of a hospital cloaked in night. Each step she took echoed across the cold tile, like the footsteps of someone trailing behind her. She turned, but no one was there. Every time she looked back, reality seemed to drift further away, as if she was slipping into a murky void. She moved towards a window where the wind howled through a crack, dragging in dead leaves. Suddenly she saw her, the woman, standing outside. Her eyes were bottomless black pits, as if they could devour Sarah's soul. Sarah held her breath and let out a strangled cry. It was her, the woman from her daughter's eyes. But this time, she stood right there, watching from just beyond the glass. Sarah's heart stopped. She stumbled backward, but couldn't stop herself. Even though no one stood at the window anymore, Sarah felt a presence, a gaze, calling her, pulling her back. Fragments of memory returned, too blurry to piece together. She thought of the time before giving birth, before everything fell apart. She remembered faintly seeing a woman just like the one in her dreams. Eyes like death. A face caught somewhere between life and the afterlife. Sarah grew dizzy. She turned toward the cradle again, but the baby no longer looked like her child. The eyes, those empty, lifeless eyes, did not belong to a baby anymore. They reflected Sarah back at herself, but there was no warmth in them, no love, no recognition. Pain surged through her chest. She stumbled forward and dropped to her knees beside the cradle. Her trembling fingers brushed against the child's cold skin. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "Who? Who are you?" At that moment, the baby opened her eyes. And this time, they weren't the eyes of a child. They were flames of frozen fire, deep as a bottomless void. Sarah couldn't look away. She knew they were the woman's eyes, and that gaze would never let her go. The cold seeped deeper into Sarah's bones, not from the air, but from something else. Then came a sound behind her, a small sudden noise. She turned. Nothing. Shivering, she tightened her arms around the child. But a thought flashed through her mind. Is this really my child? She stood up quickly, staring down at the baby. It felt like everything she had done, everything she had lived, was now unraveling, fading into shadow, into a strange, incomprehensible sound that had no beginning, no end. One morning, Sarah woke up to find herself once again in the cold, sterile hospital room, her tired eyes staring up at the stark white ceiling. The feeling was disturbingly familiar, as if she had been facing this emptiness for far too long. Everything around her felt hazy. She didn't know what day it was, only that each morning she woke to battle an invisible sense of loss. That feeling grew heavier every time she looked at her child. The baby didn't cry or behave abnormally, but its eyes, they unsettled her, as though something was lurking, an invisible darkness hovering silently around them. Suddenly, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sarah turned toward the door, listening carefully. They weren't David's. She knew his steps well, gentle, quiet. These were different, steady, like someone was approaching from within the shadows, silent, yet undeniably there. Sarah rose, a strange force seeming to pull her from the bed. She didn't know why, but her feet moved on their own, as if guided by something unseen. When she reached for the doorknob, a cold gust swept in from the hallway. The door creaked open, revealing a silent, empty corridor. No one stood there, but the sensation of being watched made her shiver. She stepped into the hallway, eyes wide, searching. Everything was veiled in a faint mist. The hallway stretched long and still, dim lights flickering above. Fear began to rise in her chest. She couldn't understand what was happening. The further she walked, the more Sarah felt her illness was not just physical. It was like something else, some unseen force, was trying to control her mind, blurring her thoughts, twisting her perception. Visions of the woman she had seen reflected in the baby's eyes returned. Clearer now, as if they had just happened. Was she losing her mind? Or was something else behind all of this? At the end of the hallway, a small door hidden in shadow caught her attention. It was unlike any other door in the hospital. No nameplate. Just an old wooden door, plain and aged. something behind it called to her. She couldn't resist. Sarah gripped the handle. Another wave of icy air washed over her. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, unlit room. Inside was a long, worn-out table and a few scattered chairs. There was something strange about this place, something Sarah couldn't explain. It felt familiar, as if she'd been here before, but no memory surfaced. Then, a giggle echoed from the far corner of the room. Sarah turned sharply, her heart pounding. It sounded like a child, but whose child? She scanned the room. No one. Another laugh, clearer this time, broke the silence. Someone was watching her. Panic rose. She began to back away. Then saw it. A figure. A woman. She stood in the corner, long black hair hiding half her face. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, silently watching. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. No answer. Just those cold, empty eyes. Eyes Sarah had seen many times before. Then the woman whispered softly, as if speaking directly into Sarah's ear. "You can't escape, Sarah. You can't run from yourself." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, but their meaning escaped her. She tried to turn and flee, but her legs were frozen, paralyzed. An invisible force held her in place. "Your child is not your child, Sarah. You need to understand that." The words hissed in her ears, forcing her to look back, but the woman was gone. Only silence remained. Sarah stumbled out of the room, her steps frantic and unsteady. In the hallway, she felt it again. Something following her. The lights flickered, unsteady. The world around her felt like it was breaking apart. She rushed back to her room, her eyes wild with terror. And then she looked at her baby. Once more. Those eyes, cold, unfeeling, not her child, not the baby she had given birth to. Everything was unraveling, confusion, fear. She could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. Everything had become a blur, but one truth echoed in her soul. She could not escape herself.